When it came to learning squad-based tactics, Riddy had been taught the same way as all the other Kafya. They used simulations. First, there were virtual simulations, which were more or less a video game with a few more rules and treated quite seriously. Then there were the dry runs, where they all moved about a training field using sim weapons that did little more than fire a small bolt of light. In the end phases, they moved about with actual weapons, all streamlined and extremely safe to new recruits. A double failsafe was built into their weapons, with built-in friend or foe software that controlled when the weapon was allowed to fire. Humans did not follow such procedures. The first few days of White Phase's Week 1 training, Riddy had spent well over 28 hours at the range with her rifle. She and the other recruits were trained fiercely on how to work, fire, unjam, and load their rifles while tracking moving targets. Then came the phase of training, where they were thudded with padded sticks and kicked in the shoulder while attempting to fire a cycle of targets.
While you are in battle, you will be hit by enemy munitions.
Drill Sergeant McFiston called out while kicking Riddy in her shoulder, and she winced painfully as she lifted her finger away from the trigger.
You will have artillery falling around you or even have objects in the environment hitting you.
Drill Sergeant McFiston swiftly kicked Shasta forward, causing the Logara to stumble forwards past the firing line and nosedive into the range gravel.
You will need to be aware of every rifle around you and every soldier firing them.
Shasta spat out a mouthful of dirt and scrabbled backwards, keeping his weapon under control and finger off the trigger while the rest of the recruits kept firing. Riddy let out a quiet growl as Drill Sergeant Al Moore thudded her on the back with a padded rod, throwing her rifle off target and forcing her to mind the trigger.
The command and control of your weapon can be the difference between killing the enemy and accidentally killing your fellow drop infantry. Combat is chaotic, and you will learn to control the chaos.
Drill Sergeant McFiston called out into the reports of rifles firing.
Software can be hacked. Digitally controlled weapons limited, but no one can hack your brain or disable your muscles with the flick of a switch.
By the time they ended the training, even the humans were grumbling from the amount of bruises on their bodies. Riddy felt like she had been worked over by multiple hand-to-hand fighters, and her ribs panged with a subdued agony. The same training continued for another 3 days. Drill sergeants kicked, punched, shoved, and stick-thwacked every shooter along the line until no one flinched. It escalated to hitting the rifles themselves, throwing small bags of sand into the rifles from all angles and pelting even the shooters with the bags. Riddy hated the bags of sand the most, as the drill sergeants threw them with a solid amount of gusto and force. Hour upon hour of being hit or pelted left Riddy a riddled ruin of hidden bruises, though everyone else that wasn't a Kafya wore their bruises openly. The next day dragged them forward into a live fire training exercise. The drill sergeants called it bounding training, in which small fire teams would leapfrog down a range toward a set of targets. Worse yet, the targets fired back when improperly suppressed by the other fire team. These targets fired a small pain pellet, though the round was gel-based and still stung like a motherfucker. Multiple drill sergeants went down with each fire team, a security measure to make sure no one truly fucked up and shot themselves in the foot. Riddy found being shot at was unsettling in a training environment, and the whizzing gel round sounded much too similar to an actual bullet. While one fire team would lace rounds downrange into the enemy, the other fire team would push up, over, or into more cover. Broken vehicles, blocks of concrete, wooden piles, etc. littered this training field, making footing unsure and wrong moves treacherous. When one fire team was set, they would share a set of hand signals to let the other fire team move forward, all while the robotic targets spat gel rounds at them. Each recruit did this more than once, as there were range NCOs that also ran the range itself. and Riddy herself did it no less than 4 times. Their 5th time around, they changed into fresh uniforms they had packed along and started treating the gel rounds as actual munitions. When a recruit was hit by a gel round, they were treated as an actual casualty. Their fire team would render first aid, in which they would then have to exfil their wounded trooper with the help of the other fire team. It was an exhausting day, as Riddy had to both drag and be dragged during the training. By the time she fell face first into the pillow, she was asleep before she could even yank her blanket over herself. Morning always came too early, and the next day was merely a repeat of the last. That was, at least, until the sim mortars started landing. During the bounding training, the drill sergeants didn't even flinch when the sim mortars were dropped onto the training sites, launched by an advanced targeting system that lobbed a plastic boom maker onto the range. Riddy had been so taken aback by the sudden explosion that she startled down behind cover, squeezing her eyes shut as sand and wooden shards rained down on top of them.
"What the hell was that?"
Riddy screamed out as Alias ducked down beside her, throwing an arm over his head as another mortar came down in front of the other fire team. Shasta hissed as he dragged his head down, another mortar landing near them.
"They're firing mortars at us!"
Your enemy is mortaring you in order to suppress you.
Drill Sergeant McFiston said calmly, packing his lip with a portion of tobacco even as dirt hissed down around him.
If you do not summon the courage to fire through this barrage, the enemy will advance on your position and kill you.
Riddy would never admit to it, but the sight of the human standing tall and not even flinching to the sim mortars coming down was awe-inspiring.
React to the enemy.
Drill Sergeant McFiston called out, and a loud hiss split the air as he smiled.
Suppress their advance or be killed.
That smile, despite everything, was the one thing that made Riddy's fur stand on end. She popped her head over the broken concrete barricade that was her current cover, and her eyes widened in surprise. The targets were now slowly moving towards them, guided along on little rails with a plow's head in front of them to clear the rail. Riddy loomed over the corner, hunching down as a mortar round smacked her with a wave of dirt and sand, then started firing towards the targets. The targets did not stop their own firing, splitting gel rounds towards them as they all started working through the fear of the explosions. Their targets began to retreat when they got within 10 yards of their positions, being slowly shunted back by a crackling counter-hammering of gunfire. Fire teams were cycled in and out and mortared relentlessly until they did not even twitch when the rounds came down, firing through the clouds of dirt and sand as they rained down around the recruits. Riddy had a hell of a time cleaning all the sand out of her fur, and the Kafia were busy late into the evening making sure all of their ears were properly clean. Saturday was spent resting, recovering, and lathering on bruise-reducing creams. Their uniforms had been trashed, and they had been arriving back at the barracks so late they did not have time to do laundry. Riddy was up as soon as the drill sergeants woke them, and she made a beeline straight for the laundry room. All but one of her uniforms were toast, soaked through with sweat and caked with more mud than cloth. Her plans came to a nail-skittering halt when she saw that Private Morris was also doing his laundry. Though he was shirtless and only wearing his PT bottoms, they had been told they were not doing anything for the day, including PT, and to treat it as a recovery day with morning chow being walk if you want it. Riddy cleared her throat, halt-stepping her way towards an available washer. Fireguard had been cycling their laundry in and out through the entire night. Rather sneaky of them, she had to admit, and some of the washers were still occupied. Morris casted her a sideways glance while plucking out a few washing pods.
Morning, Riddy.
Morning! Riddy nearly shouted as she startled, quickly shoving her laundry into the washer before he could get a look at her clothing. You doing laundry too? Morris blinked at Riddy, gesturing towards his clothing with washing pods in hand.
Yeah?
Riddy threw 4 pods into her own laundry due to the smell, They quickly slammed the lid shut so the smell of wet dog and general bodily stank didn't leak out very far. She then threw in the laundry bag for good measure before turning around and leaning back against the washer, attempting a casual tone of voice.
Yeah, me too.
I can see that.
Morris said with a confused chuckle, closing the lid to his own washer. Riddy could see, due to him not wearing a shirt, that his body was riddled with bruises ranging from a light blue to a dark green due to training, and she let out a light whistle.
You creaming?
Morris narrowed his eyes while tilting his head.
I beg your pardon?
Riddy's temperature flared up to maximum due to embarrassment, and she fidgeted with her sleeping bottoms while her ears flooded with blood.
Are you using the bruise cream?
Oh.
Morris laughed out, holding his right hand to his chest.
Oh, you meant the bruise cream. Yeah, we're all using it. Be a fool not to.
Riddy gave him the best finger guns a pair of pawed hands could manage.
Right. Because bruises hurt.
Yeah, that's true.
Morris said, and he smiled at Riddy. His smile made Riddy's ears perk up even taller, and she didn't know if she could pin them if she tried. Her eyes flicked down to Morris's chest again. Humans wore their muscles plain upon their skin, unhidden by fur despite what little there was on their bodies. Morris had a fair bit of chest and stomach fur, or Riddy supposed it was hair, technically, and a small part of her wondered if it felt any different, too.
Chow time!
Riddy barked out in a panic, drumming her hands on her washer before leaning forcefully off of it, quickly stepping away while moving around another human recruit.
See you later!
Morris blinked after Riddy, raising an eyebrow as she used her hands to press her ears to her head.
All right, see you later, I guess? Coffee are so weird, dude.
The other human said, dumping his laundry into a free washer while sniffing the air.
Do you smell wet dog?
Riddy, ears forcefully pinned to her head, inwardly screamed as she made her way to her locker. They had been told over and over to not fraternize with the humans. The Blues were going to follow that as well as they followed any rule. But she was a Yellow. Yellows had a higher margin of error when it came to breaking orders, and she whined to herself as she imagined the amount of hell that would come down onto her shoulders if she was caught even rubbing noses with another human. It was already bad enough that the humans were rubbing off on them all. Their rugged natures were slowly turning them all a little more crass, a little more uncaring to things that normally would have driven them crazy, slightly harder as stuff didn't bother them anymore. Heat that would turn a normal Katja into a puddle, they all grunted through. Pain that would have sent Riddy whimpering to a medic, she just had to deal with now, along with the human recruits. It was like she was being beaten with a rod to get all the weakness dust out of her. It didn't matter how much they whined or how much they suffered. The humans just did not care. They kicked, shoved, and checked the off-worlders as hard as they did their fellow humans, treating them equally. Despite the Katja, Pwa, and Lilgara being hundreds of years ahead of current humanity, no special quarter was given. As Riddy hastily put on her uniform, an unfamiliar orange face peered around the corner of her rack.
I noticed you were acting a little odd, Riddy.
Riddy turned her head while pulling on her uniform boots and had to fight not to roll her eyes. Hello, Enflia. Oranges were the products of reds and yellows having children, a color that walked amongst two different portions of Katja society while only being welcomed in one. Oranges were brash, haughty, and extremely self-driven, something that was valued by the reds but abhorred by the yellows. Enflia was lean and muscular, as well as a devious little shit that Riddy found to be a major thorn in anyone's side. Enflia had been the first to try and smuggle candy into the barracks after a trip to the defect, earning them all group punishment under the furious eyes of Senior Drill Sergeant Fairy Moss.
Don't you hello me.
Enflia purred, stepping around the end of Riddy's rack with a slow, dramatic twirl that dragged her tail along Riddy's waist. Power dynamics this early in the morning. Super. Riddy thought to herself, buttoning her uniform buttons and running a hand along the waistband to smooth down her fur. It's too early in the morning for this bullshit, Enflia. Tails were an odd little tool when it came to social cues. A flick of the tail along the knees was flirtatious. Swishing the tail quickly at the feet while turning was an act of disgust. And dragging the tail along another's waist was a power move to establish themselves over said person. There were other smaller cues, but the waist brushing was the most prolific.
But is it too early in the morning to have ears that stiff, Riddy?
Enflia said with a dubious grin.
It's almost as if you walked out of the laundry room
Enflia's voice trailed away as Riddy went nose to nose with her, the yellow's throat growling and neck hackles raised. Enflia's eyes widened and her tail tucked instinctively at the look in Riddy's ivory eyes. Riddy may have been raised by her father to treat the other Katja fairly, but she still had a lot of her mother in her. Are you making assumptions about me, Tofu? Riddy snarled into Enflia's face, pressing her nose against the oranges so that her own wrinkled just a little more. Or do I need to correct you in where we all stand? The barracks was suddenly rather quiet. The other female Katja were watching, wondering if this was the moment where a Khalil was about to be decided. While the male Katja were more interested in seeing two females fight. The Pwa were watching more out of mild curiosity, as they had heard Katja power struggle fights were vicious affairs that sometimes ended in death. The Lilgara were just happy for a distraction at all, having been missing the gladiatorial battles of their home world and favored pastime. The humans, however, moved in. Riddy's eyebrows shot up as she felt two pairs of hands grab her around the waist, pulling her away from Enflia as two other female humans pulled the orange Katja away. Enough of that, Riddy, Shorsey said from behind Riddy, the yellow Katja turning her head left and right to see both the female human and a male had scooped her up. No fighting in the barracks. You're going to get us in trouble. But she challenged me! Riddy spit out, kicking her feet uselessly once Shorsey and the other man lifted her up, disengaging her two-wheel drive. Shorsey rolled her eyes as Enflia was dragged away towards her own rack by her belt loops, much like a chastised puppy getting grabbed by the harness. You two aren't on your planet anymore. We don't do that here. Riddy let out another quiet growl as she was set down onto the ground again, and the humans all shared a look to each other before going on about their morning routines. Riddy spun around to glare at the gathered female Katja, and they all scattered like a flock of startled, many-colored birds. The confrontation of recruit Enflia left her in a foul mood for the entire day, but her mind did wander back to Private Morris from time to time. The ingrained scent of his toothpaste and favored cologne came to her through the evening, causing little sparks of confusing emotions to dance around her head. Enflia and the inflictions of Morris kept her in a sour mood all the way up to Monday morning, and she snapped awake at the first bark of Drill Sergeant McFiston's voice. Her bed was tangled, blanket wrapped around her legs, and she let out a tired sigh. She had been rolling in her sleep again. Rolling was a Katja tic, as when under extreme stress and turmoil, Katja will roll in their bedding to try and gather more fabric around them in a self-soothing gesture. This meant Riddy was having bad dreams, even if she didn't remember them very well, and she blinked barely up at the bottom of her rackmate's mattress. After morning PT, she got dressed, marched off to chow with her platoon, and the company once again set off on their next day of weapons training. The gull drums that swam in Riddy's mind were still present when the cattle car hissed to a stop. The door slapped open, and recruits started ambling off the deck into the range's parking lot. Riddy wasn't fully there yet, grumbling to herself under her breath as she readjusted her fast pack so it sat more evenly on her shoulders. Previous experience told her that this was likely going to be another grueling day, but the classroom on site seemed to say otherwise. For once, there was a friendly face in these classrooms, a bubbly-looking woman with bright pink hair, pale skin, and golden eyes. The golden eyes and pink hair told Riddy that this person was the offspring of a stung human. She had learned about these mutations, as survivors of the conflict against the Pactless had, at times, adverse effects to the stolen weaponry used by the roaming space pirates. Stature needle guns were a favorite of the Pactless due to their high capacity and trilling shriek when fired, leaving pulsing threads of light in the air as the munition traveled. Those hit by the munition did not suffer nearly as much damage as other entities that roamed the void. The human body even went as far as to absorb some aspects of the needle munitions. Feeding off of the odd elements, the human body had the ability to consume, adapt, and produce different natural eye and hair colors. The needles, after all, were extremely difficult to remove from the body due to their barbs, so a lot of humans just left them in their old wound channels. This in turn caused thousands of births where the infant human had blue, pink, gold, as well as green hair, combined with a myriad of odd eye colors that made them highly desirable. Riddy was not sure why one was here in the army, let alone a female-stung human.
Good morning!
She called out, waving a hand slowly in the air as the company slowly filed into the large classroom.
Have a seat, there we go. Much to learn, much to see, much to do.
Drill Sergeant Currahee leaned in towards Drill Sergeant Almore.
Why are the afflicted always so cheery? It's downright unsettling.
You'd be pretty happy if you woke up with golden eyes every morning. Almore quipped, and the two shared a quiet chuckle as seats were quickly found. When everyone was seated, the oddly colored woman clapped her hands together.
Well, hello there. Oh my gosh, look at all these aliens,
she said happily, giggling to herself as she gestured to all the weapons on the long desk in front of her.
My name is Technical Sergeant Yes, and I'll be teaching you all how these little guys function.
Riddy had been so busy staring at the odd human that she did not even notice the weapons in front of them all on the long desk. Set in tidy rows were all of the crew-served weapons the UAA Army used, one of which Riddy could identify from its girth alone, the M2. Humans may have been odd about their rifles, pistols, submachine guns, and other personally issued guns, but their larger options were seen as community weapons. Riddy had personally seen the M2 in action multiple times, and both she and the Kafia called it Geshisuek Darmahua, or Elder of Destruction. This was due to the M2's ability to shred, destroy, and kill damn near anything it was pointed at. Riddy had seen humans down an ore landing craft with just a pair of the things, stitching their explosive munitions into landing engines and causing the entire craft to face plant into the ground, exploding and killing the entire landing battalion.
All right,
Technical Sergeant Yes trilled happily, clapping her hands.
So, how many of you have seen the M2 in action while out and abroad?
Riddy, along with many others, raised their hands.
Awesome!
Technical Sergeant Yes said gleefully.
Well, while Ol Mod may be our oldest workhorse weapon, there are still many others that we still use on crew serve or gunner support roles. But due to her popularity, we'll start with the M2 first.
Technical Sergeant Yes patted the broad receiver of the blocky weapon fondly, her golden eyes casting slowly across all the recruits before her.
First designed in 1918 by John Moses Browning, this weapon has been a mainstay in the UAA military since 1933, with an average fire rate of 400 to 600 rounds per minute on the standard model. These weapons are able to destroy or suppress everything but heavy vehicles. The greatest boon of the M2 is its ammunition types, allowing their gunner to tackle all targets on a specific level. Fed via belts or Amtram racks, these weapons can fire an assortment of 50 BMG rounds.
With a showman's flair, Technical Sergeant Yes pulled up a long belt of ammunition, some of which glittered with what could only be called malice.
With the 50 BMG, there are solid ball rounds, of course, able to penetrate concrete, buildings, light vehicles, and really fuck up the inside of a dropship.
The class tittered, though Riddy shuddered. She remembered what it looked like, watching that ore landing craft get ripped apart inch by inch. It was a death she almost couldn't wish on anyone.
With the regular ball rounds are tracers, then armor-piercing incendiary, and headlight rounds for air-to-air contact. Sabo rounds designed to penetrate 3/4 of an inch of steel armor at 1,500 yards, but can dig deeper at closer ranges. There are sniper rounds, yes, sniper rounds for long-distance accuracy, high explosive armor-piercing, ramshot penetration rounds, and, of course, the legendary fairy round.
Technical Sergeant Yes said with a final wave of the hand, letting a single blue glittering round to rest on her palm. Riddy knew the mineral that made up the round, and her skin started to itch. Skip engines functioned on element 2331, a particular piece of alchemical stone that is highly enriched and able to produce a huge amount of energy. Harvested from asteroids that came through a blue hole, the element is then dragged along the surface of active stars via ore slinging in order to superheat them. Due to the obvious heat of stars and the dangerous nature of the job, enriching element 2331 is done by drones, or criminals wearing explosive collars, to make sure the job gets done. When the element is star-heated, it is bursting with potential energy, glowing white and requiring tinted eyewear when working around it. When used up, it cannot be recharged and used for a second time, so it is cast off into junk piles. The stones usually last around 3 to 4 years with constant use, as despite their ethereal nature, they prove that nothing can last forever. More confusing is how they come to be. Blue holes allow matter and light to pass through them like a one-way door, and no one can figure out what is on the other side of said door. Humans saw this odd glittering, used-up blue element and wondered if it was like their depleted uranium, accidentally unlocking the bane of anything flying within the void. Besides having the same amount of penetration as depleted uranium, the rounds audibly screamed when fired in atmosphere and had a chance to shriek through ship armor. Shrieking involves a fairy round hitting a seam or connection point in armor plating, in which the highly dense round folds in on itself and makes a short, glowing blue light before detonating in the squeeze of inertia and two elements pressing against it via the seam. These squeezed rounds have been observed creating miniature blue holes and fill 30 feet of the ship's penetrated area with element 2331 shrapnel. The shrapnel has a 100% death rate via penetrating a living body, reducing them to shrieking, howling blue streaks of light and casting a shadow on the ground or wall behind the victim. Nothing left but a single glow of light and a shadow to mark the passing of a living creature. Riddy shivered, eyeing the maliciously glittering blue round with open wariness.
Now from the M2, we go to the MG-111, the design of which is nearly as old as the M2.
Technical Sergeant Yes said brightly, hefting up the long, thin, blocky-looking machine gun.
Based off the ancient MG-42, this weapon is all about putting rounds downrange at an incredible rate of fire. These are all standard issue for the Scourskera and are held upon the armor itself by its power arm.
Drill Sergeant Currahy stepped forward, snapping his fingers to get the attention of both Riddy and the rest of the recruits.
Skera armor is earned, in which all of you may attempt the trials. It is our heaviest armor and most powerful, allowing the trooper hefting the MG-111 to step out of their pod and begin laying hate at a high rate of fire.
And it is due to that high rate of fire that only those wearing the armor can wield these weapons. They are issued to you much in the same way your SR-113 was, and you will bear their number upon your arm in addition to any others you may have.
Technical Sergeant Yes chirped, smiling brightly with crinkled golden eyes at those before her.
Those of you who do not have the Scour Scara will instead be using the M260 bore.
She rested her hands on a long, ugly weapon that Riddy squinted at hard. It had rivets. Rivets! A spacefaring race of warriors that dropped from above-orbit drop pods used a weapon with rivets on it.
These used to fire a round known as the 7.62 NATO, but now fire the usual 30-06 Heritage, while the MG-111 fires the 8mm Spandau. The bore can be wielded from the shoulder or from a prone position due to its slower rate of fire. You see, the bore fires at a rate of around 650 rounds per minute. The MG-111, however, fires at 1,500 rounds per minute.
Technical Sergeant Yes said with an inclination of her head, and she paused to let that number sink into the non-humans. The silence was loud. Technical Sergeant Yes continued on.
There is, of course, the MK-19, which has been mostly unchanged since its first days in the military. Its job is to launch 40mm grenades, and it does its job well. Besides the DN-9 rocket launcher, these are your main weapons besides the rifles you are all issued with, as well as pistols, should the environment call for it. You will all fire multiple belts of ammunition at targets at various ranges and get a feeling for how these beasts handle.
There was a murmur of excitement amongst all the recruits, including the human ones, but everyone fell silent as the golden-eyed woman held up a finger.
I am aware, as is plain to see, some of you are alien.
You are not human, and you may look down on our weapons, Technical Sergeant Yes said, setting her hands on her hips. You may have your fancy, high-tech weapons, like your Gaurail carbines, laser crop emitters, and pulse rifles. And you may view our kit as archaic, but let me ask you something. She held up 2 fingers, turning and addressing them all in a sweeping, frowning gaze that only lingered on the off-world faces. We used these weapons to dig ourselves out of annihilation and to dig the graves of the Packless. Then when your lot came whimpering across the stars looking for help, it was our weapons that cleaved through planets and scoured space of the Ur. We have weapons made by warriors and perfected through bloodshed. Treat them with respect, and remember what they were built to do. There is no stun setting on a human weapon. Everyone non-human nodded in agreement, if just to make sure the golden-eyed woman didn't frown at them again. After going over how all the weapons worked, they were then tasked with dry runs. They had to load a fake belt of ammo, rack it properly, show the other NCO instructors that it was fed, clear jams, break them down, the whole shebang. The dry run alone took 3 hours, and Riddy was already sweating through her uniform top. It was cold inside the classroom, of course, but it was Technical Sergeant Yes that was causing her to internally combust from nerves. The golden-eyed human, thinking it funny, had gathered up all the yellow Katja, all 5 of them. This was akin to gathering up the rich kids in a classroom and the teacher giving them a private lesson. It also caused a miniature power struggle within the small group. 2 of them were males, pretty little things that Riddy knew would fetch a massive dowry back home, and the other 2 females were power-hungry little shits that were in it for the prestige. It surprised Riddy, but she was quietly wishing she had been stuck with the blues instead. Technical Sergeant Yes's floral body spray and soft voice was playing hell with Riddy's nerves, not helping the overall discomfort. Riddy knew she liked men. That much was obvious, and it had been beaten into her head all through her life that she was to marry a male Katja in the future in order to produce children. At the same time, there was something to the female human. Riddy wasn't sure if it was her oddly long canines or easy flowering smiles, but she kept making Riddy's heart beat faster. Technical Sergeant Yes had accidentally touched her hand while showing her how to load the MK-19, discussing the ghost round dilemma, and Riddy had to fight to keep her blood pressure down. They were finally released out onto the range, staffed with an array of weapons as well as attending NCOs, and Riddy was somewhat happy to be back out in the heat and away from Technical Sergeant Yes. The first weapon Riddy got her hands on was a well-warmed-up M2 sitting on a power jack, as all the humans had gone before the off-worlders. Having only seen it in action, holding the pair of handles in her own hands felt as if she could take on any enemy with it. It was huge, blocky, rectangular, and radiated a primal power that she could not put a finger on. So much potential. War was within the thing, a creature made purely of steel and lubricants that fired around larger than most people's fingers. Sure, the Katja and other races had their own larger weapons, but they were not as raw as the M2. Their weapons had fire control systems, friend or foe sensors, digital readouts for range, wind, and terrain. The M2 had a butterfly trigger, a rear peep sight, and a hooded front sight, a raw, pure, unrelenting steel workhorse that plowed death and harvested souls. Riddy remembered she had to load the thing first and popped up the top of the feed tray cover with a twist of the bolt latch. With a pair of clicks, it came forward, and Riddy dragged over the belt of gleaming 50 BMG ball rounds. There were two ways to load this metal creature, one being to feed in an open link, or opening the feed tray to do it manually. Riddy thought the open tray version was less fussy, having to only worry about the feed tray assembly while making sure the first round and link were seated. She slapped the cover down, wrapped the top of it with her fist, then took her right hand to the charging handle, grabbing it with a palm-up grip. With a satisfying, systematic chorus of metal parts moving in concert, Riddy pulled the charging handle back, let it slam forward, then pulled back on the handle again. There was no hum of power like the weapons of her home world, no twittering chirr of magnetic coil coming online, just the quiet, soft ring of an empty link. A weapon forged by killers, honed by warriors, championed by these iron-blooded soldiers of Earth, and patient by nature. It waited for her to press her thumbs down onto the butterfly trigger, the entire weapon's nature seeming to coil, eagerly awaiting the release of its bolts and to split the air with its own voice. Riddy hunched down behind the rear sight and pressed down with both her thumbs. There was no controlled pulse of a highly advanced weapon, no light thrum of power as it discharged. The M2 bucked and thundered in her hands like a living animal, splitting the air with its war cry as Riddy kept her thumbs pressed down on the butterfly. She let 10 rounds fly down range without any real thought of aim, then let off the trigger. The weapon had the same energy as wielding a club into battle and beating an enemy to death, a profound intimacy of purely mechanical energy propelling what was nothing more than a short, leaden arrow through the air. It made her shake. Riddy let out the air she didn't realize she had been holding, her breath shuddering as she now understood the power she held in her two paw hands. The M2 was the biggest stick on the battlefield, and its only job was to beat things to death.
Give it a little more juice, Private. It's a machine gun,
Drill Sergeant Currahee said, tapping her on the side of the head.
And try aiming this time. All you did was scare the piss out of some moles.
Riddy nodded, her ears pinned back as she got down further behind the weapon and pressed down on the trigger again. She couldn't fully make heads or tails of how it felt, but it was humbling that the weapon shook her like a child. Each burst rattled her hands, arms, and shoulders, shaking her bones as if she were a sack of dice. When one belt was empty, she had to quickly change out the weapon, all while being timed by Drill Sergeant Currahee. By the time she finished all of her belts and was sent on to the next station, her hands were shaking. Riddy looked at her hands, rotating them at the wrist back and forth while watching her twitching, quivering fingers. Her nerves buzzed, her brain sang, but the M2 was merely a warm-up to what would be the weapon that would take her olive drab-stained heart. From the M2, she went over to the station with the M260, and its slow rate of fire made her think of it as the M2's child. It was comfortable, mildly soothing with its thrumming chatter of fire, and was very easy to control. The addition of a buttstock made firing it even easier, and she found it to be a very smooth weapon to wield. Then, there was MG-111. The weapon was mounted to a control arm that, judging by the servos, worked overtime as soon as the weapon was mounted. It was long, thin, and bristled with an energy that was far more chaotic than either the M260 or the M2. Those weapons had a powerful, stalwart energy to them, but the MG-111, it felt a wild, frantic animal in Riddy's hands. The high-tailed buttstock sat firmly in the shoulder, sending a signal to the servo arm that the time was nigh. The whole setup sat next to a small table bearing boxes of ammunition belts, which an NCO leaned against. Riddy pulled the weapon into her shoulder after getting the belt into place. She would also have to do a barrel change, the hot barrel being automatically spat out onto the ground. A new barrel then had to be shoved into place, or else the weapon would literally melt itself. The servo arm whirred and trilled as it activated, its job to both support the weight of the MG-111 as well as help with the recoil. And stars above, was there a recoil? Riddy's pearly eyes snapped wide open, and she actually bared her fangs as she pulled against the heavy trigger. The break on the weapon's barrel spat a six-armed flame, throwing dust through the air and shoving the weapon into Riddy's shoulder as if it were testing her. She only held the trigger for a scant 2 seconds, and 50 rounds had already split the air with a deafening blur of noise.
"Angry little bitch, ain't she?"
a female human sergeant said from beside Riddy, making a note on her data slate.
"To pass this station, you aliens don't have to complete a full belt without stopping. You just have to get used to how the weapon handles. For now, use this belt to get a feel for her." "A feel for her?"
Riddy shouted, her nerves flaring just in the same way they did the first time she had to fly a scout skimmer.
"It feels like it wants to kill me."
The NCO shrugged.
"Ah, well, all part of her charm."
Riddy reset herself behind the weapon, pulling the sight back up to her face, and snarled as she pulled back on the trigger. The deafening, mad cackle of the MG-111 filled Riddy's ear pro again, splitting the air as if the weapon thought calm was an affront to its metal god of bloodshed. The muzzle flash from the break was so bright that it turned Riddy's pale ivory eyes orange and yellow, casting a wild fire of light across her pupils. By the time the weapon slammed to a halt, Riddy had gone through an entire 100-round belt in only 4 seconds of total trigger time. Riddy was breathing hard as she lowered the weapon with a whir of the servo arm, squinting down range at the single target she had been trying to aim at. She had sawed it in half, the limp cardboard target laying destitute in the gravel of the range.
"Now you know why people will nearly kill themselves to earn the armor,"
the female sergeant said next to her, smiling.
"Recruits tear their muscles to pieces just for the chance to earn the right. No alien has managed this task yet."
Riddy panted out into the hot Georgia air, even her knees shuddering as she held the beast of a weapon in her hands. She pulled back on the long vertical charging handle, knowing she'd have to in order to load it. Its mechanical transition was manic, as if eager to keep chewing through brass and too impatient to wait.
"Load a 1,000-round belt, after which you will do a barrel change,"
the sergeant said flatly, tapping on her data slate.
"You may be the first to manage holding it up for 300 rounds, if you have the stuff." "Stuff?"
Riddy asked, pulling over a long belt of ammunition and opening the feed tray cover to the MG-111. The NCO nodded, smiling over at Riddy.
"Yup, the stuff. Now load and fire."
Riddy nodded, shut the feed tray with a slap of her fist, pulled the belt's loading tongue into place, and got behind the weapon. The servo arm gave a whir, and Riddy pulled back against the trigger. Holding that maniacal weapon in place on her shoulders was a feat of strength alone, and she gave in only 300 rounds into the long burst. Riddy let out an angry, ragged exhale as she lowered the weapon, both frustrated at the recoil and impressed the weapon was able to sustain such a high rate of fire. "Not bad. I can tell you got a little over 300 there." The female sergeant murmured, leaning to the side to spit some dark, foul liquid into the range gravel. "Keep at it." Riddy shook her head and brought the weapon back up. She managed to keep the trigger pressed for 500 rounds this time, baring her teeth and yelling against the thrumming thunder wave that was the MG-111's percussion cloud of noise. She shouted out in a rage against her quaking arm muscles, letting the weapon drop before ripping the MG-111 back into place on her shoulder to finish firing the belt. The weapon, despite its archaic nature and history, let out a series of trilling beeps before opening a small cage on the side of the forward heat shield housing. A glowing red-hot barrel was spat out from it, causing Riddy to dance and step around the hissing steel alloy while fishing out the other barrel. Much akin to a magazine, Riddy shoved the barrel into place and the cage snapped shut, letting out a single beep to show it was secured. "She may be old, but they all have a few modern tricks to them," the sergeant said, and tapped on her data slate some more as she typed something in. "You have 2 more belts to try and achieve human passing goals. If you can't do it in 2, you're moving on to the MK-19. Riddy set her face in a grim mask of determination as she went through the loading process again, pulling the belt into place with a crisp click of the loading tongue and bringing the weapon to her shoulder. She was already tired. Both her brain and her body knew that, but she took this weapon as a personal challenge, if not a personal affront. The MG-111 was acting as a gatekeeper between her and the barest level of human success rates, and she refused to be barred like the rest. The weapon was just another animal of Earth, and she was going to tame it, come hell or high water. Riddy took aim and pulled back on the trigger. She managed 600 rounds, but her muscles failed her yet again. She finished the belt, then angrily pulled another into place. She held it up for only 500 rounds this time, letting go of the trigger and letting out a pained, aching exhale as her arms quaked from the abuse. She had failed, and she knew it. Riddy pulled the weapon back to her shoulder and finished the rest of the belt. The MG-111 had won, and she had been filtered out with the rest of the offworlders. When she went to turn to the female sergeant, she instead came face to face with Drill Sergeant McFiston.
"Tired, Private?"
Drill Sergeant McFiston asked her in a tone that was inlaid with dozens of other questions, all probing her for weakness. Riddy froze, still holding the steaming MG-111. "No, Drill Sergeant. I am unable to master this weapon."
"But you want to, don't you?"
Drill Sergeant McFiston said in an even more unknown tone to Riddy, his dull hazel eyes watching her closely. Somehow, the human was layering in second and third fractions of conversation merely in how he spoke, asking 3 questions instead of 1. Riddy chewed over his words, his tone, the way he stared at her. Even though her tail was shaking from exhaustion and her frayed nerves, she nodded once, trying to hold his gaze with her own. "Yes, Drill Sergeant."
"Belt!"
Drill Sergeant McFiston barked out, making her visibly startled as he kept his eyes on Riddy's until a box was set on the table next to them. Drill Sergeant McFiston turned to it, slowly dragging out the long chain of brass by its loading tongue.
"Ain't a one in this company that thinks an alien can master the MG-111. Everyone believes you're too weak. Not enough iron in your blood. Not enough human in you to wield our hardest steel. Not a one of you has passed this station yet, and I know that no one after you will manage it either. It's making my military bearings grind together, and I do not like the chatter they make in my head."
Drill Sergeant McFiston placed the loading tongue into Riddy's trembling paw hand, and she pinched it with her fingers as he leaned in towards her. His breath brushed against her face fur as he whispered, touching the brim of his campaign hat to the side of her head.
Give me one, Private. Give me hope that I am not just wasting my time training a bunch of non-humans to play war.
Riddy nodded and loaded the belt with lightning speed. Despite the sudden rush of energy, she failed at 500 rounds again, drooping at the shoulders and letting out a ragged exhale.
Belt!
Drill Sergeant McFiston bellowed, opening the feed tray of Riddy's MG-111 and ripping the partially spent belt out of it. Riddy was stunned, not daring to move until Drill Sergeant McFiston slammed the belt tongue into her paw hand again.
Load!
Drill Sergeant McFiston roared, and Riddy loaded the belt into place. She got only to 300 before her arms gave out, her nerves frayed and jittered in alarm when Drill Sergeant McFiston ripped the belt out of her weapon again.
Belt!
Drill Sergeant McFiston bellowed and slapped the feeding tongue into Riddy's hand again.
Load! Load, damn you! Give me one! Give me one, Private Riddy! Do not tell me all I have done is waste my time and energy on some scrawny skag from the stars.
Riddy, with shaking hands and lips twitching, loaded the belt as quickly as possible.
Fire!
Drill Sergeant McFiston shouted, pulling off his campaign hat and pointing it downrange past Riddy's head.
And don't you dare drop that weapon, Private Riddy. Don't you dishonor me by dropping that fucking weapon. You hold it up. You keep firing. You don't stop until the weapon does. Do you hear me? Fire!
Riddy pulled back on the trigger and leaned into the weapon as it started splitting the air apart with its report. She was perhaps 400 rounds into the belt when she felt her arms want to give way. But she slid her lips away from her teeth, baring her fangs at her own weakness as she trembled, holding the weapon as steady as she could. Drill Sergeant McFiston was yelling at her, gesturing with his brown round, but she couldn't hear him. Hell, she couldn't even hear her own heart with the amount of noise this damn machine gun made. Her muscles ached, strained, and shuddered. Her aim was more of a concept rather than a practice at this point, and her knees were starting to give way. As the round spewed out of the MG-111, Riddy pinned her ears back, her face in a full twisted snarl as she fought against fatigue. Her eyes radiated with a bonfire of light from the flash of the MG-111, the shrill beeps of the barrel overheat warning inaudible, but she still pressed on. The words crept back into her mind as her eyes began to fill with angry tears. Her own military wanted her to become a nurse, and she had to fight to see combat. Her own mother wanted her to get married and have kids, even though all she wanted to do was live. The humans thought she was weak, and had already assumed they would all fail. She just wanted to be strong, to be a warrior, to belong where she wanted to be. She screamed. It was an angry, frustrated, rueful scream, but it was all she could do as she held on to the weapon with all the strength she could summon from within her. The scream itself could not be heard beyond the weapon, and if anything, Riddy was just screaming at the weapon itself, this long piece of steel alloy that was designed to keep her out, just like the color of her fur. When she ran out of breath, she ran out of brass, and the weapon fell silent as she did, almost as if the weapon itself had swallowed her weakness and kept it to itself. Riddy panted hard, dragging air into her lungs as if she were starving, her shoulders and back quaking as the heat of the barrel warbled the air in front of her, hissing as lubricants were cooked away. Riddy blinked to herself, sighing out and coughing, but quickly became highly aware that all of her drill sergeants were around her.
"Link is still in place. Brass is below the plate,"
Drill Sergeant Prince said, pointing a finger at the MG-111.
"You know the rules."
Drill Sergeant McFiston grunted, narrowing his eyes at Drill Sergeant Prince.
We both know the rules, and if the payload is still spent, it still counts. Open your tray cover, Riddy.
Yes,
Drill Sergeant.
Riddy croaked, fussing with the lever as her numb fingers fought against her, buzzed to near death by the vibrating weapon. A single piece of 8mm brass had failed to fully extract, likely due to lack of lubrication, and was halfway out the barrel. Drill Sergeant McFiston, campaign hat back on his head, leaned forwards and pulled back on the charging handle, catching the brass before it fell fully from the bottom of the weapon. The single piece of brass was clenched in his scarred fist, and he held it up before himself, Riddy, and the other drill sergeants. He opened it, and there in his palm was a still hot, slightly marred, spent piece of 8mm brass.
1.
Drill Sergeant McFiston said with a small, satisfied smile, then tucked the piece of brass into his shoulder pocket. He stood up straight and slowly took the MG-111 away from Riddy.
Private Riddy, you have passed this station. Move on to the Mark 19.
Riddy nodded, smiling brightly with ears tall and chest swelling as much as her exhaustion allowed.
Yes, Drill Sergeant.
She then made her way down the line towards the grenade launcher, knowing that everyone had their eyes on her back as she awkwardly ambled down the line.
And that was Chapter 5, The Big Bang of the Drop Pod Green Sci-Fi series, written by Guardbro and proofread by Franners. If you like these stories and others like them, be sure to subscribe to Guardbro's Field Desk, join us on Discord, or become a member on the Ko-Fi. Ko-Fi members get a special channel on the Discord, sneak peeks and future chapters, as well as access to the works in progress of all artwork. Our first shirts are Charlie White, Allspark 113, E-Machine O, Cody Jarrow, Death's Dancer, Insane Medic, The Other Killjoy, Callus Dread, and Aaron Wilbur. E4 Mafia, James Buckner, Sonic Arrow, Nox Vox, Darkside, Kiwi Bastard, Lacunai 8, Lacunai, Josh Beatty, Matty Boy, Crusader 0625, and Tab. Snuffy Squad, Split Iris Bear, Mika, Aaron Wilbur, Damon Bain Plays, Scott Anderson, Vertus, Damon McQuinn, Super Stink 64, Elder Rock, Croman, Dow 3K, Jules, Blonde Lore Lord, Thrace Vega, David Schonholtz, Andrew N. Gill, Yeti Potato, Skelters, Kite Zero, Classy Cthulhu, Ranger Uninspired, Diesel Dog, Coffee Commander, Anto, Inquisitor Matt, Duncan D, 132X, 14mm Alan Solano, Noodle, and Sir Martel Martlesby. Until we see you next time on this side of the veil, I'm Larissa, and this is Guardbro's Field Desk.